Welcome back everyone to the Crypto Weekly Recap, where we jump in and recap how the cryptocurrency market has been playing out over the week. We have a look at what we spoke about on Monday for Bitcoin's price chart, and we look at what we spoke about on Tuesday with the XRP price chart. I was expecting to come on here today and speak about how boring of a week we've had and how nothing's really happening and how we've just been kind of chopping along and not really following much of our structure here. But it turns out that overnight price has broken down quite aggressively and we have some major news events unfolding. We have the richest man in the world and the most powerful man in the world going at each other on social media. And we also have a very similar example of how price has played out in the past on the Ethereum price chart here compared to how things are playing out today on the left here for Bitcoin, which I find quite interesting. So we're going to jump into all of that today and more. It's going to be a pretty exciting weekly recap. There's a lot to cover. We also have silver breaking out to the upside if you know anything about silver. So let's jump into all of this, speak about what's happening and what this means for the crypto market. I think the first thing we have to cover here is the news, which is the turning point right now and what's got everyone panicking and has the attention of the public. And it is the Trump and Elon battle going on right now, which is causing a lot of friction in the markets as Trump is cutting funding for a lot of Elon's projects. Now we have Elon firing back as well with some statements here that he's been dropping on his Twitter. But what does all of this really mean? Why is silver breaking out in this moment? Why is Bitcoin crashing in a moment like this? And how does this have anything to do with these two guys beefing right now? So firstly, on Monday, we spoke about how that this was likely at a temporary bottom for Bitcoin and price should bounce off this level. And we could potentially revisit those weekly closes similar to the way we had done on the right side here with this high B wave. However, I want to play a clip here that was recorded on Monday and speak about something else I was seeing playing out on the charts, but in a smaller time frame here. However, on lower time frames, when analyzing this move, and I know this looks chaotic, this is kind of what I'm seeing right now, and I'm actually seeing that this entire structure is playing out on a much smaller time frame here, and that our levels actually aren't being hit, and that what's happening here, the way price is playing out, as chaotic as this looks, it's actually the way that all of this has ended up playing out, but without meeting the levels that we were looking for, which would be back up at 110,000. And then what we could potentially see is price roll over from here the same way it did here on the right, and that right now we are in something like this, except just much lower as far as price actually goes. So as crazy as this all might look right now, and the fact that I think we are performing similar structures just on a much lower time frame here, and that how it's likely price can actually sweep these lows the same way it did in this move here and just give us that lower low, and that eventually what we could see is a lower time frame impulse bounce from there, and then that actual C leg come in, which would land us right at that 99,000 area we've been talking about, between $99,000 and $100,000. And that if price continues to play out like this, we could see that on a much smaller time frame, where we just see like the lows swept here and then price bounces to here, and then bang, there's our C leg, and that's kind of the end of it. I think there's a chance of that also playing out. However, right now in this bottom scenario, things are pretty chaotic, and it's about just letting price play out before we can get a better understanding of how things are going to happen. And hopefully things play out like they did in here, where the low was a little bit different. So as you can see, it turns out that that craziness has actually played out, and we are falling down to that $99,000 region. And as you can see here in our structure that we have on the right side, which we've been using as our guide here, we've seen that price did fall down to a similar region here where it found support at the high of the last major consolidation range before this breakout occurred. And you can see that this area is also below an area of consolidation as well, where we found support in here. Now, if we have a look at today's structure here on the left, we can see that this is quite similar. This is the top of the consolidation zone right here, and then this is that corrective stage in here before things broke out and ended up forming the structure that we have here now. And you can see price is still short of these levels. So what do we think is going to happen here on Bitcoin, and how is this going to play out? So I think as far as things go with the news right now and how this is affecting the price chart, I feel like this doesn't have that big of an impact on what's going on in crypto. And normally what you want to see in these capitulation style events, like if we have a look back here on Bitcoin price chart, when we see these lows come in here, this was marked by the tariff scare. When we've seen the lows come in the bear market, that was the FTX scandal. So what you ideally want to see when price comes to that capitulation moment and you find those lows that you're looking for, you want to see a big news event that comes with that. What we had when price sold off on Friday into this A-leg correction, there was no news. Price was simply just selling off. Now what we start to see is a bit of a scandal, a bit of a news event, something to spook the crowd. And I think that we are quite close to actually finishing this off, and that this might be, if these levels are met here, the end of the actual correction that we're waiting for. However, price can play out quite confusing in this. You can actually see price shoot back up and then come down and find these levels, similar to the way we've seen on the right side here, where we thought we were going to get it in a move like this back in June last year, and then price just shot back up, and then we got that plunge to the zone we were looking for. And how that these corrections can be quite ugly and confusing, but eventually you will get that zone that you're looking for, and that's where the local bottom is found. Now you can see today we're actually quite close to that. However, I don't think price is going to play out like it did on the right side here, where it shoots all the way back up. And how I think price is actually going to play is like this Ethereum example we had back from 2021. And today's video, originally before all this news came out and we've seen price break to the downside, was going to be talking about this Ethereum example here and how price played out and how similar that is to the structure now. And that we're also going to talk about a leading indicator here for Bitcoin showing us where we are in the cycle, which is the M2 money supply, which is actually this indicator right here, which we'll get into a little bit later. However, let's have a look at the Ethereum example first here on the right. And what you can see is that these two structures are quite similar, Bitcoin being on the left here and Ethereum from 2021 on the right. And what you can see is that in this zone, the only difference here is that today's price has broken through the all-time high. And when this structure played out back in 2021 on ETH, it didn't break through the all-time high, and that we've seen this similar style correction take place before a break and a back test below the all-time high. However, on a much closer breakdown of the structures, you can see things are playing out extremely similar here, and how Bitcoin has been sitting on trend the same way ETH has, and then ETH actually broke down in here. And what you can see is that in the initial breakdown, there was a little bit of a pop back here, and then we got that flush down to that low. And if you have a look at how ETH found its low back in 2021, it was on top of the consolidation range here and at the top of the double bounce here. And if you have a look at Bitcoin, this is that consolidation range, and this is that double bounce here on Bitcoin, which again lines up with our chart we have here on the right, which we've been using as our example to try and find our low. So I think we are getting a lot closer to finding that bottom here at 99,000 roughly. However, the way this correction will take place and structures that will form can be quite chaotic. Like you've seen in the clip we shown earlier, all these structures that played out in this whole zone here played out just in this. And that I was looking for a breakdown earlier in the week as we were seeing those corrective structures continue to be formed, and it ended up playing exactly like that clip and breaking down here. So now it's about deciding whether if we're going to bounce like we did here and then come in for that plunge, which would be something like so, or are we going to do things like the Ethereum example here, where you just get that plunge right there. Like right now we're in something like this, and we've seen a bit of a relief bounce, and maybe that plunge comes and then we form our bottom in here, and then that's it, it's over. However, now it's just a matter of waiting and seeing and waiting for those key levels to get hit before taking any trades. But I do think this news that's playing out right now will wash over quite quick, and I think that these two guys will get their problems sorted. And I think a lot of that is going to come to the fact that Tesla has dropped 25% in the last 24 hours here, and Tesla is back in its support region here for a pretty clean back test on the back of bad news, which is exactly what you want to see when things are usually likely to come to an end. So as bearish as that all seems, let's have a look at something more bullish here, which is what this video was originally going to be about before we seen the news break last night. And that is the M2 Global Liquidity Index. And what this is you can see the overlay here on the Bitcoin price chart. This is the global liquidity of all the major superpowers in the world. And the easiest way to think of it is how much money do each of these economies have liquid right now. But what's most interesting about this indicator here is that it is a great prediction tool for seeing the direction of all markets, including Bitcoin here. And what you can see here is that even back in 2022, when Bitcoin was in the bear market, you see this major sell-off in the M2 indicator here. And that what actually happened is when liquidity turned back on and markets started pumping, you've seen the M2 global liquidity spike here. However, Bitcoin's price was still quite flat in this time, just kind of going sideways. But then what ends up happening over the course of a year is Bitcoin's price actually catches up to the M2 global liquidity here at these same levels, which was where the M2 actually broke through its previous high, the same way Bitcoin did in early 2024. And then as you can see, after the M2 actually broke through its high here, went into this long period of consolidation from these ranges here, which it eventually broke out from. Meanwhile, once Bitcoin had performed the exact same structure, it went into a long period of consolidation here before eventually breaking out and reaching the same level yet again as the M2 has. Now, what I find most interesting about this indicator is that you can see that once the M2 actually came up and broke through its all-time high here, it rejected from these levels, pulling down, similar to the way Bitcoin has broke through its all-time high here and actually come and now pulled down. The exact same way that the M2 did in this zone. And now what's most interesting about this indicator is the fact that it is a great tool for predicting the future. Most indicators tell you what's going to happen after it's already happened. But on the global liquidity index here, you can see that after this correction that happened in here, it moved up and broke new highs and is roughly, if we were to compare this to Bitcoin right now, is sitting at about $130,000. And right now, Bitcoin is in a very similar structure. However, we are still in that corrective phase here. And what this indicator is telling us is that the next move for Bitcoin is simply that push up to $130,000, which is just further confirmation now that the bullish bias that we have here, that eventually when this correction ends, price will break to the upside, is now further confirmed with another indicator that appears before Bitcoin. And as you can see, that these tops have come in before Bitcoin found these tops. These corrections came in before Bitcoin went into these corrections, and that the next move in this indicator is up, and that is what we are waiting for here on Bitcoin. On top of that, that coincides with this example here from Ethereum, which would lead Bitcoin to eventually consolidate here and then push to the upside and take out its highs. And that also lines up with our example here that we've been referring to, where Bitcoin eventually does push up and break these highs here, which would lead altcoins to go on and do the same thing. So let's jump into XRP and the altcoins and have a look at how they're all playing out. So on Tuesday's video, we spoke about the bearish and the bullish scenario. However, the bearish scenario was that if XRP price wasn't to push high enough here and then find support and bounce in a move like what we're having now for Bitcoin, that it was likely that XRP was going to set new lows here, as it wouldn't have bounced high enough in this time. And it looks like that's what we're seeing here on XRP, and that it's going to most likely revisit this local range low here, where we can see XRP has found support many times at this level before, and that the only time we've really broken down from this level is on that tariff scare, and that it's very likely that XRP, if we do see Bitcoin go a little lower, will revisit this area and most likely bounce off here. So in the short term, we could see price go a little bit lower for XRP and find support on this line, where you can see it's found support so many times before. However, I think XRP is going to do what it does every time it gets down to this zone and bounce from here quite aggressively. So I've actually gone out and purchased more spot XRP in this recent sell-off, now that I've seen that not only do we have price breaking down, but we have a news narrative attached to it, which is exactly what you want to see when a bottom gets formed. And if Bitcoin is to do what we think Bitcoin is most likely going to do next, which is follow that M2 money supply and push to that $130,000 area, that in a situation like that, XRP would likely bottom out here and push quite high once we see that breakout for Bitcoin. And I think we are in that process now of figuring out where that low is for XRP, and it could just be a little lower, or it could just consolidate here and then go and we see the reclaim. However, I think we're in that zone now where XRP feels like it's on a Black Friday sale, and that this is potentially that last buying opportunity and that last bounce on support that XRP will get before it shoots back up to the upside here. On top of all that, having a look at the XRP dominance here, you can see that XRP, following its example here from early November before XRP price shot to the upside, you can see that we're just nearly there on the dominance. It is quite close to breaking down and finding support levels to where it found support back in November before it took off, and that it's likely XRP is acting the same way it acted in a very similar moment here. And what's funny about this moment here on the XRP dominance is right in here is where Bitcoin actually found its bottom, and that this sell-off in the dominance here, which looks like a final flush, was actually just Bitcoin and the rest of the market outperforming XRP for 2 weeks before XRP price ended up shooting up to the upside here. And now we have XRP playing out quite similar to the way it has in the past, and that the first sign we need to see for XRP to eventually bottom here is Bitcoin to shoot to the upside, which should give us the bottom of the dominance for XRP here. And the reason we reference this chart is because when XRP dominance goes up, it doesn't just mean the price goes up, it means that it's outperforming the rest of the coins in the market, which means it is the best purchase out of every other coin. And right now we are, if we're following this example, we're roughly 2 weeks away from XRP being one of the best performing coins again in this market, like we've seen back in November when it shot up 600% over the course of just a few weeks here. And right now we are in that zone in the dominance where it is finding that bottom before we can potentially see XRP outperform the rest of the coins in the market here. And the good news to take from all of this is that it's happening a lot faster than it did in the past, and that eventually things can get exciting. And it's most likely that towards the end of June, we could see this completely reverse and be back at these breakout levels here, where we can eventually see Bitcoin break again from those all-time highs. And that in this moment right here, once Bitcoin's broken and grinding to the upside, is when we see all the altcoins go with it. And this will most likely right here be the moment XRP starts to outperform the rest of this market, and that we are either right now in a moment like this, or we're just short of finding support, or in the capitulation moment right here where we will find support, similar to the Ethereum example, where Bitcoin ends up bottoming out in this zone, which is the same zone that we have here. So there's really nothing to panic about in a moment like this, and the fact that we're seeing news accompany this dump is exactly what we want to be seeing, and that it's most likely, once this bottom can form and this correction can be over, that we do move to the upside. And seeing coins like silver actually break out from a range like this gives hope that there's going to be some kind of similar price structure play out, where altcoins like XRP, for example, will break out and outperform Bitcoin in the next move up. And that if Bitcoin is to follow this M2 global liquidity like it has done for the last 4 years and push to this $130,000 region next, that we will see major altcoin outperformance in a move like this. So over the weekend, we'll be waiting to see how price plays out. Hopefully we can see that one more push down and this come to an end. Otherwise, this thing is most likely going to get drawn out to be a little bit longer, where we see price recover from here, and then eventually we will get our touch here on supports that we're waiting for. Either way, now it's a matter of waiting and seeing which scenario is going to play out here, and that if these zones get met, that these supports hold, and then we can officially say that we think the bottom of this correction is in, and that we have already seen the A, B, C play out. So we'll be back on Monday to go over the Bitcoin price chart and see how things have played out over the weekend. And hopefully we can see that bottom get formed and this correction be over with sooner rather than later, and see price expand coming into the end of June. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and leave a like on the video. It helps a lot. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them down below in the comments, and I'll see you all back on Monday when we can go over how this ends up playing out and hopefully see that bottom come in. Until then, have a good weekend.